Well, this is the last Sunday of 2013, and it's the last Sunday of our year-long focus on faith. And that is not something that I've ever done before or spent a whole year focused on one subject. It's not something that Brian has done. And we weren't sure, but one of the reasons that we did it is a verse that Brian read, the first sermon in this series, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And you stop and think about that for a second. You know, as Christians, we're not trying to earn God's favor, not trying to earn salvation, but having received it freely through His grace, we certainly want to please God. And that verse says, without faith, there's no way. It is absolutely impossible. Faith is that important. It's that central. And I don't know about you, I'm hoping, like me, that you have learned about faith in this past year. For all the time, all the study I've done prior to this, I've still learned a lot about faith, and I've grown in my own personal faith. And so that's been great. But as I got ready for this last sermon in our year of faith, I started thinking about it, and I realized I still have some of the same questions that I had and that Brian and I had before we started this series. Faith is definitely a central subject, but it's not always a simple subject. And there were some questions, some issues. And before we started this series, Brian and I talked, and we thought, what is required to have the leading that you should have to take a step of faith? Because if you're not following God's leading, then it's not faith, it's presumption. It's basically you saying, God, here's what I'm going to do. Could you take care of it? And what is necessary to have that adequate level of leading from God? And then as we got ready for this series a while ago that we called An Ordinary Life of Faith, even that changed. We were going to talk about taking a step of faith, and we began to look, and it's the Bible, especially in the church age, it talks a lot more about a walk of faith than steps of faith. And so we wondered, what's the difference? What should we be doing? And part of the problem is when you think about faith and you think about the Bible, the examples that come to most people's minds are things like Abraham. You remember God called him out of his home country. He said, leave your land, your home, and go to the place that I'll show you later. And that was definitely a step of faith on his part. And you have things like the literal step that God told the Israelite priests as they were at the Jordan, about ready to finally cross into the promised land. He says, the Jordan was at flood stage. He says, when you step in the water, that's when I will stop the river flowing and all of Israel can cross. And then there's also, it comes to mind, you think of Peter. In the midst of the storm, he's in the boat. Jesus is walking to them on the water, and he says, Jesus, command me to come to you. And Peter walks on the water. Now, the thing with those examples, the reason that there's an issue, there's a problem, that there's questions, is there's some differences there than what we have. First of all, they had very clear leading. God told Abraham, I don't know if it was audibly or what, but there was no question. God said, leave your homeland and go. God told the Israelite priests, step into the river and the water will stop. And even Peter, he said to Jesus first, command me to come to you, and Jesus said, come. So they had very clear leading. There was no doubt, should I be doing this or not? The other thing, and we started to talk about this as we got ready for that Ordinary Life of Faith series, we looked and we realized all those examples, the ones that come to mind, they're found in the Old Testament and the Gospels. You don't see an example like that once the church starts. In Acts chapter 2, everything prior to Acts chapter 2 is really Old Covenant. And the new covenant starts there, and there is a difference. There are some things that are different. For example, we're not told to offer sacrifices. God has made that change from the old covenant to the new. Well, has He made a change when it comes to faith? And so as I got ready to preach this sermon, I asked a question that my wife has taught me to ask. What does faith look like? Now, I can be very good at talking about something quite a lot, and sometimes a long time. And at the end of it, she'll say, yeah, but what's it look like? And so I don't know. And if I don't know exactly what it looks like after a year of talking about it, maybe you don't know what it looks like. And if so, why didn't you tell me? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to try to take all the stuff that we've done and just say, all right, what's it look like to live by faith, walk by faith? And that's where we're going to start. 2 Corinthians 5:7 is another key verse. And it says, for we live by faith, not by sight. This is the new NIV translation, and so it says live. The older translations say walk, but it's the same idea, and I'll be using both of them. That makes it clear. This is pretty central, again, to the Christian life. But once again, if that's all you had, what's it look like? I don't know. And to understand what a verse is really telling us, to understand the full meaning of a verse, three things are important. The first one is context, and that's the verses around the verse in question. So it might be just before, just after. It might be chapters before. If you're in a book, like Romans 12, you got to understand Romans 1 through 11 to get that. It might be even outside of the book, but context is the first thing. Second thing, to understand the meaning of a verse, you need context. And the third most important thing to understand the meaning of a verse is context. You got it. It's that important. If you just take a verse out of its context, it can mean all sorts of things. So let's look and see what leads up to Paul, the author of this book of Corinthians, what leads up to him saying, "For we live by faith, not by sight." So 2 Corinthians chapter 5, start at verse 1. It says, "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose is God, who has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come." I'm guessing you're familiar with that verse, "We walk by faith, not by sight." But I'm also guessing you're not familiar with that context, because I wasn't. I forgot. Oh, those go together, talking about this idea that we have this earthly body, but when we get to heaven, we'll have a heavenly spiritual body. And Paul's saying, all things being equal, I'd prefer the heavenly spiritual body. And then ending with that idea, the Spirit is basically our guarantee. God says, I'm going to give you the Spirit now while you have this earthly body. And then it's a promise, it's a guarantee that one day I'll give you this spiritual, eternal body. That's the context of we live by faith, not by sight. Now, the next verse gets even closer to that. It bridges the gap somewhat between the two. "Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord." You look at that, and again, that's another verse I'm familiar with. And usually, for me at least, I see the usual focus is on that word away. We're away from the Lord, and it's somewhat negative. Here we are now away from the Lord. We're not there with the Lord. But I think the focus for Paul is emphasis. It's not on that word away, but it's on the Lord. That is who we're away from, and that's really his idea here. It's like right now we are away, but we know, and he says that, we are confident that when we die, that's who we're going to be with. We're going to be with God. We have that confidence. We have that faith. And so that leads into 2 Corinthians 5:7, where he says, we live by faith, not by sight. What's he doing? He's summarizing that, and he's saying, we can't see God. We can't see the fact that when we die, we go to be with God. No one's ever seen that. But as Christians, we don't live by seeing. We don't live by sight. We live by faith. And the point that he's making there in that specific context is, we have faith. There's an element of reality that we don't see, but it is real. It is very real. And the faith is based on, it's not just this irrational thing, it's based on evidence. What we know about everything, it adds up. We have confidence because of that. And you think about it, faith is the heart of Christianity. Everything about us is based on faith. We have faith that there's a God. We don't see God. We have faith that Jesus was his son. We can't see that. We have faith that his death on the cross paid the price for sins, and that when I accept that, I'm forgiven, and we have faith that I will spend eternity in heaven. We don't see any of that. Our entire Christian life, that's what he's saying. It's not about sight for us. It's about faith. That's the point he's making. And then the general lesson, what can we then take out from that verse for just in general? I think what we should get from that is we're to be living with that mindset, with that approach to life. We live by faith, not by sight. And what I think is most interesting, I notice he's not making a case for that. He's not like, I have to prove to you. One, he's not commanding us. It doesn't say live by faith, not by sight. And two, he's not even making a case that, hey, as Christians, here's the way our Christian life should be. I just did that to make the point, but his is just an aside comment. You notice how he's talking about, well, we got the guarantee of the Spirit. We're confident we'll be with God. Hey, that's just the Christian life. We live by faith, not by sight. And then he goes right on. It's just like, it's so obvious. That's what the Christian life is like. Paul doesn't stop to make a point of it. It reminds me of Ephesians 3:20, where he talks about God, and he just makes this same author, Paul, he makes this little aside, who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. He doesn't stop and try to prove that. It's like, that's just who God is. And the ultimate aside is in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't stop there and say, now let me prove to you there's a God. No, creation proves there's a God. And this is the same way. He's not trying to prove to us this is a Christian life. He's like, that's just it. It's just so obvious. The Christian life is a life of faith. It's a walk of faith. But it still raises that question, okay, what's it look like? It begins to get us there, but what's it look like for us today? Why don't we see examples in the church age? From Acts chapter 2 on, why don't we see things like the priest stepping in the Jordan and Peter walking on water? Well, I thought about that. And there's other times the Bible does this. It's not clear the result of something. And the reason, I think, is to keep us from expecting exactly the same. Last time I preached, I told the story about the widow who gave everything she had. And you remember? Jesus said she gave all she had to live on, and it raises the question, well, okay, what happened to her? The Bible doesn't tell us. And I think one reason it doesn't tell us is we think, well, if I do something similar to what she does, I'll get something similar to what she got. Oh, there. I just know what's going to happen. And God's up in heaven saying, no, I don't want you to think it's always going to work out exactly the same. And it's not so much he's like, I don't want you to get your hopes up because it may not be as good. There's also that side of that, like Ephesians 3:20 says, we may limit God. God's able to do what? Immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Well, if we see specifics, we're like, oh, well, here's what it is. God's up, no, you have no idea what I'm going to do. It's going to be way beyond what you ask or imagine. And so I think that's the reason, because there is no reason to think God's changed how he responds to our faith. That it's different now for us in the church age. Our situations have changed. Now, I don't know about you. I've never had a need to walk on water. It'd be cool, be fun. But I've never had a need like, oh, I really need to walk on water. But Peter, it was part of that idea of establishing who Christ was and them coming to know it. There was a need for that then. But God's power hasn't changed. And even the basic way he uses it when in response to our faith hasn't. In that verse, Hebrews 11:6, the whole verse says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. But look the rest of it. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Look what that verse is saying. Whoever would draw near to God. Well, that's our purpose, isn't it? That's our goal in life. God created us to have a relationship. Sin broke that relationship, so we need to draw near to God. And look what it says, all right? Whoever would draw near to God, first of all, you need to believe that he exists. It sounds logical, sounds foundational. It has to start there. You have to believe there is a God because you don't see him. It's possible not to believe. But then it also says you need to believe something about his nature. And look what God chose. God could have chosen any trait. He said, God could have said, whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he knows everything. Now, that's an important trait about God, isn't it? Must believe that he exists and that he's all-powerful. That's important. It could have said, whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he's holy. God's holiness is very important. And then I thought about it, just this morning. What would have been maybe a little safer is God could have said, whoever would draw near to me must believe that God exists and that he loves everyone. Because then it's not as specific as rewards, because rewards can definitely be abused, can it? We can, God's going to reward me. I'm going to get this and this and this, and we get back to that expecting. And love would be a little more general. I thought, well, God, why didn't you go with that? But he didn't. God inspired, the author of Hebrews says, here's the trait I want you to put down. You have to believe that I exist, and then I'm going to reward those who seek me. I know it can be abused, and we're going to talk about that later. God says that's what people need to believe about me. Well, that begins to fill in the blank a little bit of, okay, what's it look like? But it still has that question of, okay, what about a walk versus a step? The Bible specifically says we walk by faith. It doesn't say take a step. We just look at examples in the Bible and call them steps of faith. And so we've come to say that, step of faith, step of faith. Maybe steps were for then and walking's for now. It's a little different. It's, walk's just a little more ordinary. And that's what we get now. They got the steps, we get the walk. Is that it? Well, as I stopped to think about it, what is a walk? It's a bunch of steps, isn't it? Walk from here to there, you got these steps. And from here to there is not much different, but if I walk from here back to there, I've got to go down. Not all the steps are the same. Some of them are a little more difficult than others. And I think if that's true with, a regular walk, maybe it's true with faith as well. All the steps aren't the same. And we take whatever step we're faced with. As you walk, you say, I'm going to walk from here to wherever. Okay, some steps are going to require me to go straight, down, up, difficult. They're going to be different. I take whatever step I'm faced with to get where I'm going. Well, you think maybe it's the same with faith? Not every step is going to be this extraordinary thing where God has to come through and provide. But some of them will be. Matter of fact, most steps in our walk of faith are really just going to be obedience. Sometimes we don't think about it, but just obeying God's commands, his principles, that's faith. Because sight would tell us I'll be better off, in some situations. I'll be better off if I don't, talk about God at my workplace, because then they won't get down on me. Or, I'll be better off if I don't take a stand and risk my job. I'll be better off if all these things, we would look at it and sight would say, don't follow God's principles. It's faith that says, yeah, you need to obey God. So a lot of our steps are just really obedience that's based on faith in God, that it is better to obey. But every once in a while, we do come across a step. We're faced with something where, all right, God, if you don't come through, this isn't going to work. I don't know how this is going to work out. It's on my path that you're directing me, but I don't see how it's going to work. And God says, good. Good. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. It pleases God for us to take some steps sometimes that we don't know how it's going to work out. Otherwise, we're all focused on us, and we're basically saying, God, I'm not sure I can trust you. Now, here's one thing to keep in mind. Sometimes it's not a step that we take. Sometimes we find ourselves in the midst of a situation. We lose our job. We get a report about our health. Well, I didn't choose that, but there I am. And God's saying, all right, now it's not so much where you step, it's how. It's how are you facing this? Are you trusting me? And so I look at that, and I do think, again, it's a matter of us take a walk of faith, a life of faith that consists of various steps. And so that begins, again, to crystallize, well, what's it look like? But then the big thing that comes to mind, what about the lack of specific leading? And I think about people that I just, have either made some mistakes or, well, I thought it was a step of faith. Or maybe just abuse the idea of, I'm trusting God. And no, you're really doing what you want and you're hoping God will bail you out. I look at the Bible examples and they're so clear. God told Abraham, there was no doubt, whether it was audible, however it was, there was no doubt. Leave your hometown. God told the Israelite priests, step into the Jordan. We don't have that degree of clarity, that degree of specificity, or do we? As I was getting ready for this sermon, I listened to another sermon on a totally different topic. But the preacher read a verse, and it got me thinking. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 says, all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. And it was that last phrase that really struck me. And man of God there, that's specific, but it's talking about all Christians, men, women. So, the Christians may be complete, equipped for every good work. In other words, it sounds like we have everything we need to live the Christian life right here. That's what that seems to be saying to me. God gave us the word. He inspired it. It's all we need for whatever we face. So we don't have the same level of clarity and specificity. You can't flip in here and say, all right, what's it say for Steve Vinson on, December, whatever day this is. We don't have that. But maybe we have all we need. Well, if so, what's it look like? And I think what it looks like is the fact that God gave us directions. He says, here's what I want you to do in general. It's going to look different for each one of us, but the general, for a church, on the church level, he's told churches, what? Go and make disciples. I want you to go and make disciples. I want you to tell them about me. After they accept me, I want you to help them know more about me, to grow, to serve, to share. That's a church's purpose. And so as I look at that seems to me to say, as we are pursuing that purpose, as we are walking along that path, whatever step we encounter, whether it be a step of just obedience, or whether it be a step of that kind of trust and reliance, like, God, are you sure? God says, yeah. Whatever step you face, in that direction I've told you to go, take it. And then for us as individual Christians, our purpose is sort of the flip side of the church. Go and make disciples as a church. Well, our purpose as individuals is to be disciples. Once we accept Christ, well, we're to grow and mature. We're to serve, and we're to share the word with others and continue that cycle. And so that would seem to say to me that God's leading is, okay, as you are on that path of being a disciple, whatever step you encounter, whether it be a matter of obedience or a matter of reliance on me that I'll get you through, take it. In general, our purpose is to glorify God. That's why we were created, to glorify God. Well, what's that mean? It means to point others to him, let them know there is a God and what he's like, that he is in control, that he loves us. Well, what shows that more than steps of this kind of faith we're talking about here? And even obedience shows that. You can't glorify God if you're disobeying his principles, so those steps glorify him, and certainly the ones where I don't know how this is going to come out, God, I'm trusting you. That glorifies God. Points people to him, helps us realize who he truly is. And so I look at that. What does a life of faith look like? Maybe it's simpler than we think. Maybe the verses that talk about we walk by faith and not by sight, and without faith it's impossible to please God, maybe those verses mean we take every step of faith that we're faced with. Maybe those verses mean instead of asking, when should I take a step of faith? We should ask, when shouldn't I take a step of faith? I think our default setting, to use a computer term as Christians, should be take the step. That's, in general, what God wants. Take the step unless there's some reason not to take the step. And as I look at it, I think that's key. I think that's what faith looks like. Well, it does leave us with that question, okay, well, how do I know? Because those exceptions are pretty important, Steve. When shouldn't I take a step of faith? How do I know this is a situation where I shouldn't just step out there and trust God to provide? Because, again, I've seen what I see as the mistakes that people thought, well, I thought I was trusting God, and you look how it turned out. I've seen individuals that, boy, it doesn't seem so much like you're trusting God as you're really just trying to get your own way. We've seen churches, as elders, we've seen it, we've talked about it. As we think about steps of faith, we've seen a couple churches here in town that, have ended up getting into financial trouble and going under, being bought out basically by larger churches. And I think if you would have asked the leaders of those churches that went under, they would have said, well, we were trusting God. So how do we avoid that? How do we check against that? When shouldn't I take a step of faith? Or really, I think a better question of, when isn't this a step of faith? When is it really presumption or something else? And I think the place to look for this is the book of James. James is all about faith, whether it speaks directly to it or it's something that is a part of it. James is about faith, and probably the most well-known verse in James is James chapter 2, verse 26, where it says, faith without works is dead. And once again, as Christians, we need to know, all right, faith is hugely important. Faith without works is dead. What are works? And the context, and we won't read the verses, but the context tells us, James gives 3 examples. First of all, he talks about if someone comes to your house and they're cold and hungry, and you say, hey, well, go in peace, be warm and well-fed, and you do nothing. That's no works. Well, he also then tells some examples from the Bible of people who did show works, had works with their faith. He talks about Abraham, when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Abraham was going to go through with it. That was faith with works. And he talks about Rahab, the prostitute in Jericho, when the Israelite spies came and she hid them and she sent the other people from Jericho off in another direction. That was faith with works. And so you look at those examples. What are works? Well, the first one is totally obedience. When it says someone comes to your door, they're hungry and they need food, don't just say, be in peace, well-fed. Give them some food. Give them some clothing. And there's no indication there that, well, it's like my last food. If I give it to them, I don't know how I'll get by. I have to trust God. No, it's just do it. Be obedient. But the other two, they go beyond just obedience. They have that element of, all right, if I do this, I'm trusting God. As a matter of fact, you read that about Abraham in the New Testament. He thought God was going to have him go all the way through with killing Isaac, and God would bring Isaac back from the dead. He trusted that. Rahab definitely seems to have trusted God. She says, I see what your God of the Israelites is doing. Mine ain't doing nothing, so I'm trusting your God. So there was that element of trust that's included in works. And so you take that into account, and that's saying that faith, in other words, saying we trust God without works that show we trust God, well, it's dead. And that's interesting. It adds an element because James later goes on to say, faith without works is dead. Can that faith save him? And usually in our mind, we're thinking, well, people who don't do good things. Absolutely no good things. Can that faith save a person? But you got to bring this into account and say, if I never take a step that relies on God, is that faith? Is that a life of faith? So James is definitely making the point. We need to be taking some steps at times that trust, that expects, that relies on God. But I think he knows too. It's like, all right, that can be abused. I better better tell him sort of the check, to look at that. And so in James chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, he says this. He says, you do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. You think about it there, ask. Well, faith is asking God to provide, isn't it? When I take the step, I'm asking, probably praying very hard, God provide, asking. So he's saying sometimes we don't have something because we just don't ask. And, it doesn't say why. You read the context and you might think maybe it's pride. I don't need to ask God. But then he says there's other times when we do ask. And so in other words, it's saying we take some sort of step of faith and we don't receive. Why? Because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. And even pleasures, the context, how important is it? Because God says, I've given you all things for your enjoyment. It's not wrong to take pleasure in some things, but in that context, it makes it clear that pleasure is sinful, worldly pleasures opposed to God. In other words, you're trusting God to give you something that's opposed to God. That ain't going to work. And so motives are important as we talk about asking and steps of faith. But then James goes on at the end of that chapter, James chapter 4, 12 and 13 to 15. He says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. That's my plan. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and will also do this or that. Now, again, this is a passage I'm familiar with, and I've always thought, if you would ask me, I thought, well, it's sort of a morally neutral passage. It's a person who sort of forgets that God has a part to play. Makes the plans and forget, oh yeah, God may change them. Because I look at myself, and boy, do I do that. I plan out my day. God, I'm going to do this, and even good, I'm going to work on my sermon. I'm going to work on this, and the day goes nothing like I planned. And I just forgot. And I'm thinking, sort of morally neutral. Didn't seem like a sin, just didn't think about it. But look what the next verse says. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. That's not just a person who innocently forgets. He's saying, by not taking God into account, either actively or at least getting in the habit of stopping and saying, God, if it's your will, that's arrogant. To think that I can plan out things and it's going to go just the way I plan. That seems to be another check. And so you take all that into account, we're to walk by faith. The leading that we have and that we need is the Bible, this general purpose in life. Our default is to take the step of faith that we're faced with. Is there a check to make sure that it's really faith? Yeah, it is. Check your motive. Is it selfish? As you talk about, I'm trusting God, or is it really, it's not really God who's getting the glory and is the focus and the emphasis, it's me. Or what about my attitude? Am I going about this and relying on my own resources, power, skills, whatever, and leaving God out of the picture? Because he's not going to bless that either. That's not a step of faith. Again, it's a step of presumption. And it makes sense that God would expect us to ask these questions because we're having faith in God. Not some divine genie, but the creator of the universe who says, it's my universe. You get to live in it, but it's mine. I get to control it. That's who God is. And it struck me, we spend so much time, at least I know I have, and I've talked to other people, when we're faced with these steps of faith, we spend so much time focused on what should I do? If I do this, then this, and this might happen. If I do this, then what should I do? And God's up in heaven saying, the question you should be asking is, why are you doing it? How are you doing it? Spend more time on your motives and your attitude than thinking about the details of the choice. Well, there's one other check, too, as I thought about it. Because you know what? Even if your attitude's good and your motives are good, remember what we saw about a month ago again with that widow? We talked about faith. And faith definitely has that element of expectation. If I act, God is going to do something he wouldn't do otherwise. I can expect that. But it also has that second element of surrender. I don't know what he's going to do. And I need to expect that. Faith is surrendered expectation. And it makes sense. We just said as a church, we don't have God's specific leading, take this exact step. We also don't have his promise, I will do exactly this. We take the step that we're faced with and we trust God. He is going to reward us in some sense, but we don't know exactly what that's going to be. And it may not be what our 21st century American culture says it should be. It may not look like a blessing at first, but I need to trust God that it is a blessing, it is a reward. All right, round it all up. What does faith look like? What does faith look like? I hope this helps you. I see four things that a life of faith consists of. First of all, just that. God tells us, live and walk by faith. It's not just one of the things a Christian should do. All right, well, I'm to obey, and I'm to be nice, and I'm to have faith, and it's like over here. No, it is our life. It is the DNA of a Christian's existence is faith. We are to walk and live by faith. In the course of that walk, we need to take the steps that come along. Take the steps. We have God's leading. And I have too. I've been, well, is God telling me this? God gave us his purpose. Again, as a church, make disciples. As individuals, be disciples. Everyone, glorify God. That's the leading. If the step that you are faced with glorifies God, take it. That's to be our default setting. Now, what about this? What if more than one choice fulfills that purpose of glorifying God, of making disciples? The elders were faced with this a little while ago. We had two choices, and we truly, either one would be obeying God, trusting him, because we know how it was going to work out. And so we said, well, let's just spend the time, and we all prayed about it. We all sought God. We came back, and every one of us got leading from God in different ways that said, this is the choice to make. It was amazing. So there may be times like that when either choice, and it might be sometimes either choice would work, take one of them. So there may be that. Some steps will be just a matter of obedience, obey God. Others will be that kind of step that says, God, I have no idea how this is going to work. I'm relying on you. I'm trusting you. And again, as I said before, not all steps will be our choice. You're going to get in situations where you have financial difficulties, where you lose a job, where you get a health report, where you didn't say, I chose to take that step. You're just there. Again, God's going to say, all right, it's not a matter of where you step, it's how. How are you facing this? How are you handling this step that you've been put in the midst of? And also, as I thought about this, and this was just this morning, no two walks are going to be the same. They're the same in general, that we're to be trusting God, but you need to be very careful about telling someone, well, here's what God made. You didn't need to do exactly this, this, and this. Well, God may be working in something different in me than he's working with in you. And so our walk is going to reflect that. God's going to put us in the midst of situations that deal with the need I have. Yours may be different. So in general, we all need to walk by faith, but they won't look the same. And I think, in talking with my wife, we had a great conversation. She brought up a point. Our past steps are going to be a key, an indication of our future steps. You begin to see what God's been doing in your life and the way he works with you and say, this is what God wants me to do. This is the direction he's leading me. And it becomes clear. So take the steps that come along. Third, trust and expect that God will reward. We have that promise. Hebrews says that. It says God will reward. Matter of fact, it says it in such a way that's almost an instruction. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Well, as a Christian, of course you want to please God. It's sort of like that understood element. Take the step. Trust God to reward you, but also be surrendered in your expectation. And we don't like that side. I got to thinking, those two sides of faith, expectation and surrender. I can name you all kinds of books on the expectation side. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat, season your divine moment, fresh faith, all these books. Because, even though it's a little nervous about taking that step, it's exciting. I can't name as bidding books, and maybe it's because I haven't bought the books about the surrender side of faith. Like, God, I'm trusting you, and this isn't really exciting. This isn't what I like. There's not as many books, or again, maybe I just haven't bought them because they weren't appealing to me. But that's another side of faith, is that surrender. It won't always go the way we want it. God will reward us in a way that wasn't what we at first had in mind. And then the last thing, check our motives and our attitude. Again, we spend so much time on the details. God, should I do this? Should I do? Well, if I do this, might happen. If God's up, why do you want to do it? Do you want to do it to glorify me? Go ahead. If you want to do it to glorify you, I'm not going to be with you. Is it in line with your purpose? Does it follow what I've been showing you in life? God said, okay, check your motives. And here's the thing, as we talk about checking our motives, maybe, okay, I'll do that. Jeremiah says, because the motives are in our heart, Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful above all else, so you need to get some outside perspective. I remember a story from that book, If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat. And it told about a person, he was a professor at a college, and he loved teaching, he loved writing and all that. He got an offer to be the president of another college, and he was going to take it. And he thought, maybe I should just get some perspective. So he invited in some friends, and he said, I want you to ask me questions. I want you to help me see why, what my motive is for this. And as they talked to him for a while, one of the friends said, after listening to you, I hear all the reasons you wouldn't like it. You'd have to give up your teaching. You have to give up your research and your writing and all those things you love. The only reason I can see that you want to do this is you want to get your picture in the paper as the president of a college. And the guy, he didn't know. He wouldn't have said that at first, but he said, you're right. His friend said, well, then maybe you shouldn't do this. Find someone you can trust and have them ask you some questions about your motives. I think that's what it means to walk by faith. It is the walk that we take all the time. We take the steps that are there. We expect God to reward in His way, and we always check our motives more than the details. That's a walk of faith. And as I said, a walk consists of various steps. A walk also starts with one step. And the step that it starts with as a Christian is to initially accept Jesus as your personal Savior. Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Again, there's evidence for that. We can have faith in that. But unless I personally accept it, it hasn't done anything personally for me. I'm still lost in my sin until I believe that Jesus was the Son of God, died for sin, and rose from the dead, until I repent and turn to live for Him, and until I'm immersed in baptism. If you're here today and you're not sure, have I done all that? Am I there? Or you want to say, I know I haven't, and you want to make that decision, let's stand right now as the praise team leads us in this song. And come forward. We have people that would love to speak with you and tell you what it means to take that step of faith.